De aquella viene la revolución, para que se asustan será para mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Fascist resistance in East Ukraine and Russia and Donbass. Long live the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Long live anti-imperialist internationalist solidarity around the world, the heroes of the fight against fascism, Nazism, which is rearing its ugly head once again, in particular in Ukraine. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 79, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. Today, Donbass against fascism, an eyewitness view, exposing mainstream media lies about the conflict in Donbass, which some call Eastern Ukraine in mainstream media. During today's episode, we're going to provide you with an eyewitness view of the fight against Ukrainian fascism and NATO imperialism. We speak with a good comrade of mine, a longtime friend, who recently visited the region on a fact-finding trip. We talk about what's actually happening on the ground and how corporate news are lying to us about the conflict. We're also going to connect the war abroad with the war at home, discussing how the U.S. government is funneling billions of dollars, $80 billion more to Ukraine, to a fascist government, to the Azov battalion, while abandoning its poor right here, just a few miles away from me, Skid Row, LA. People are starving. Mothers can't feed their children. So the war at home continues while the war abroad continues. And joining me today, none other than my good friend, a really amazing comrade, somebody who has been in the movement for many years. I have a lot of respect for John Parker, a Peace and Freedom Party and Socialist Unity Party senatorial candidate based in South Central LA. Shout out to South Central. John recently traveled to Russia and the Lugansk People's Republic to meet with progressive anti-imperialist allies. John embarked on this trip with the mission of showing solidarity with the people of Russia and Lugansk People's Republic in their struggle against Ukrainian Nazis in the Donbass and beyond. Please check out his website, johnparkerforyousenate.org. Please support his campaign. John is somebody who has been in the movement fighting the good fight long before it was trendy, long before anyone even knew what all of these things were. Thank you so much for joining me, John. How's it going?
Thanks, Ramil. It's nice to be here. And so it's such an important show and such an important issue today that, I hope I can add some to it.
No worries, John. It's always a pleasure having you on. And you're somebody, like I said, somebody who has been speaking out against Ukrainian fascism, especially since the 2014 Euromaidan fascist coup against Yanukovych. And you have been participating in the solidarity movement with the people of Donetsk and Lugansk, who have been under attack for many years now by the Ukrainian fascist government. So why don't you tell us a little bit first, before you talk about your recent trip, why don't you first tell us about how you got involved with the solidarity movement, your overall analysis of it, and what people need to know?
Yeah, well, our good comrade Greg Butterfield was in touch with a lot of the folks from Borotba, which is it's called Union Borotba. It stands for struggle. And it was, they were trying to create it into a political party, the folks from the Donbass region. And one of them was from Odessa in Ukraine. And they were trying to make a legal political party. And the coup that happened in 2014 that was supported by the United States kind of derailed that and many other things that were going on. Legislative structure was basically taken over by this coup. And so there was a lot of things that people were not able to do after that. Anyway, for the 8 years after the coup, that was supported by the billions of dollars in funds from the U.S. and the training of mercenaries by this group Blackwater, which now calls itself Academy. After that, the people in the Donbass region of Donetsk and Lugansk were faced with constant bombings, wars, threats, rapes, the war crimes, and the media didn't say anything about it. Nobody seemed to know anything about it or want to say anything about it. And so they act like right now this war has just started in February, but no, this war started in 2014, and 14,000 people were killed in the Donbass region, and nobody seems to want to talk about that. And that's we felt like we needed to go and at least in the invisibility of those people so that they could understand more of the genocide that was going to happen in February if the Russian military hadn't stepped in, which is why they don't talk about it, I think.
Most definitely. I'm glad you said that, because a lot of the framing in mainstream media is the complete opposite. They frame the Russians and the people of Donetsk and Lugansk as fascists who are hurting the poor Ukrainians, and it's Zelensky and the Ukrainian people who have been the victims, and the Russians are the big bad enemy, the scarecrow, used as a justification for expanding NATO. Now they're talking about Finland, another country on Russia's border, possibly joining NATO, which is very scary. And can you imagine if it was the reverse? Imagine if Mexico and Canada entered a military pact with Russia. How would the U.S. respond, right?
Yeah, especially if it was as belligerent as NATO has been. I mean, after the Warsaw Pact was dissolved in 1990, some stupid idiot Gorbachev dissolved it.
You're right.
just okay, I'll just give up all my weapons and you guys do whatever you want. And that's what they did. The NATO decided to start. They first started bombing Yugoslavia in 1999, bombing 10,000 homes. Killing Chinese journalists and all kinds of stuff. Then, of course, they went into Libya, Iraq, Syria, killing millions of people because now nobody could stop them. It's the most violent, belligerent force that in the history of humanity is the NATO, and it's under the leadership of the United States and always has been. So they've doubled in the last 20 years. And then they promised Gorbachev in 1990 that they were not going to go east and they weren't going to expand, and of course they did anyway. And they're now surrounding Russia, and they wanted the Ukraine to also be a member state, and that was kind of the last straw, because a member state with a military, which we'll talk about later, I guess, about the fascists that are infiltrated the military. And the fact that President Zelensky said that he's willing to have nuclear weapons on the territory, just 5 minutes away from reaching Moscow. Of course, the Russian people and the Russians in the region, and the people in the region are going to feel threatened by this. And then, the fact that they're being asked by a Russian-speaking population in the Donbass region to help them. They've been asking for a long time for recognition of their independence and by Russia, and also to assist in this war against them. So they finally had to, they asked, look, we're going to die here. Our children are going to die here. There's genocide. They got about almost 150,000 troops on the Ukrainian, the border between Ukraine and the Donbass region. They're ready to go in. So we need help. And the Russians answered the help, but they never say that in the Western media. They never tell you that this was a request from an independent region, and didn't they have a right to respond to that request to stop a genocidal humanitarian crisis?
Exactly. Yeah. I always make the analogy that imagine if in the U.S. the U.S. government was systematically murdering Mexicans in LA under, let's say hypothetically under Trump, they were systematically murdering them in the street, shooting them down, and the Mexican government steps in to help save their own people on lands that actually belonged to indigenous and Mexican people. It's like that would make sense. But then when it's framed around the world with Russia and Ukraine, like, people lose their minds, and it's just crazy. By the way, shout out to everybody who's watching and listening to Itzel. Thank you to the USSR for defeating fascism. That's exactly right, Itzel. It is because of a communist that fascism and the Nazis were defeated. To Comrade Big Teal, peace, comrades Ramiro and John. Shout out to you. By the way, if you have a question for John, he was in Donbass previously. If you have a question for him, please put it in the chat so we can talk a little bit about what it's actually like on the ground. So speaking of that, John, tell us a little bit about your trip. When did you go? What did you see? Who did you speak to? And what was going through your head at that moment?
Yeah, well, we decided to do the trip because it's there's so much propaganda directed to the people in the United States and from Western Europe as well, vilifying Russia and saying that they're just targeting civilians and all these kinds of things. So one of the ways to try to stop a liar is to try to talk about the other instances where they lied, and we did that and things like that. But because these lands are so far away, and because Ukraine has gotten rid of about 3 different media outlets over there, they've jailed journalists. In February, during the month of February, they jailed I don't know how many, or maybe 100 or so journalists, and they're still doing it. So the information isn't getting out here. So the only way we could do it is to show the information, is to go there. So that's why I went there on behalf of the Socialist Unity Party to find out what is going on. I mean, we knew a lot of the things because we talked to people in the area, but we had to kind of see it for ourselves. So I started in Russia. And it was very hard to get there because of these sanctions and embargoes against, and they're making it really hard. So I had to take a very circuitous route to get to there, and then started there. And then we went to some of the May 1st celebrations in Russia, and May 2nd, the massacre of Odessa, the House of Trade Unions that was burned down by the fascists. And then on May 9th, by May 9th, I was already in Lugansk. And so I was in Lugansk for about 5 days, I think it was. And thanks to the folks from Borotba, we were able to get to actually the front lines and hear the blasts and the noise and the fear and avoid the mines that we couldn't walk on, and all kinds of wild stuff there. But we visited shelters where people were staying for their own safety, because the roads weren't safe, and we got to hear from folks about what drove them to the shelters, and almost 90% of the people were saying that what drove them to the shelters was that their apartment buildings were being bombed by the Ukrainian military, whether with tanks or whatever other kind of artillery. One woman said at one point that she went out, she couldn't believe that because her neighbors are Ukrainian, and she said, I couldn't believe they were bombing. And she told them, why are you bombing? There are Ukrainians here. You're bombing your own people. What are you doing? And of course they didn't. They just laughed, and so it turned a lot of people around in terms of supporting Ukraine who were living in the Lugansk area. To see that kind of brutality that was going on against them. And it was only when the Russian and Lugansk People's Republic soldiers got to the areas that this horror stopped. And these shelters, they didn't have food, they didn't have water, because they couldn't get fuel. And the way they got fuel was by using water pumps, which you need fuel, and the generators to get electricity, and they didn't have that. So without the humanitarian aid that the Russian soldiers were bringing in, these people would have starved to death, died of thirst. And one of the women who was a caretaker for the place, she was brought to tears talking about how they were just abandoned. And she was talking about she was so worried about her child that they didn't have anything to eat. Then the trade unions in Lugansk that would be responsible to get food to those shelters and things, they couldn't do it because the roads were too dangerous, because they were occupied by the Ukrainian military. The Russian soldiers risked their lives to get the aid, even while it was occupied by Ukraine, to the shelter, and that's what saved their lives. And now that we went to that shelter, and now it's under control of Lugansk People's Republic in Russia. The name of the Rubizny, I have to look it up. I'm not familiar with these names the way they are, but I'll find out. But yeah, that's just one experience that we had.
Wow, powerful stuff. I would imagine must have been insane to because you're hearing one narrative in mainstream media, that Donetsk and Lugansk are evil and Russian controlled and these horrible things. And then you're actually on the ground and you see a totally different reality. So I must imagine the frustration and anger you feel when people repeat the mainstream media narrative talking points. I do have a question from Joe the Euro Squatter. Hi, comrades, for John. How was Victory Day in Lugansk? I imagine it must be bittersweet at best. I'm not sure if you were there on Victory Day, but maybe if you want to talk about the significance of Victory Day and the fight against fascism from the people that you spoke to over there.
Yeah, I was there in Lugansk on Victory Day on May 9th.
Okay, nice. All right, cool.
But they really couldn't do much because of the danger of being attacked. So they didn't want to put their populations at risk. So there was small things going on at some of the memorials. They also had a memorial for the Bolshevik Revolution as well. Some people were there as well, but and you saw a lot of cars going around with the flags, and you see a lot of hammer and sickle flags in Lugansk.
Yep.
You see a lot of that stuff. And people were talking about it, but there were some celebrations, but they all had to be, the military had to kind of be there to protect the folks from any kind of sabotage or anything that was going on. And which was frustrating because people wanted to celebrate it. But on the other side, on Ukraine, in Kiev, President Zelensky has banned, even though he came out saying that he celebrated the Victory Day, they've banned the Victory Day there. And everybody knows Victory Day means the celebration of the defeating the Nazis. So why would anybody want to ban that? So they have
I wonder why.
Yeah. I was asking somebody, what would happen if I went to Kiev with a sign saying, thanks for stopping the Nazis or something like that? And he said, well, you'd probably in 5 minutes, you'd get arrested.
Wow.
But yeah, they banned it. They don't have there's a curfew there. So it really says a lot about the government. And it just reminds me of the anti-war movement here and other folks who were saying that this is just the smokescreen, the issue of the Nazis in Ukraine. It's not a big issue. It's not, there's only 2% in parliament. Well, in the first place, they shouldn't be illegal at all. That's a big deal. But that's not the case. They are infiltrated. I mean, when you go to Lugansk, you talk to the people there. I talked to a journalist from Belarus also, and she was laughing. She said, of course, that the whole state is a fascist state right now because they've infiltrated so deeply into the military and into the parliament. And, they're getting Zelensky appointed a governor of Odessa, who was an open Nazi from I think the right sector. The Azov battalion, this is the other sector. They are now officially part of the military and things. And so, when folks kind of laughed at people and laughed at us for saying one group even called us cartoonish for saying that the Nazis were a big problem in the Ukraine, and saying, well, Zelensky is Jewish, so he can't possibly be. Well, no, Obama's black, but look what he did to Africa with AFRICOM.
Right.
So
Exactly.
There's like no real analysis going on about what was going on, and folks didn't know what was going on, and they were just, I don't know if it was out of fear because there's such a barrage of anti-Russia stuff that they're afraid of losing their sponsors or something. I don't know. It's fear. It's hard to tell the truth, but you got to tell the truth because they're trying to push World War III, and we have a historic responsibility to not allow that to happen.
And the Azov battalion that John is mentioning, this is a picture of them waving the flag of NATO on the left, the North Atlantic Terrorist Organization, as I like to call them, the Azov battalion flag in the middle, and the swastika, the German Nazi flag, all the way on the right. This is where your tax money is going to. This is where the money that should be funding homes and mothers and kids and schools and jobs, this is where that money is going to. All those weapons you see, all those trucks you see in the back. And it's infuriating. We should be pissed off about that as people living in the belly of the beast. Another great question that someone else had in the chat. It's an interesting question. Shout out to Comrade Emma. Can we talk about why the Russian troops didn't stop in the Donbass region? It is a question which frequently comes up. What do you think about that, John?
Well, the point that Russia said that they're going there is once to stop the genocide against the people of Donbass region, but also to stop the cause of that genocide, which is the Nazi infiltration of the military. And so, you know, they weren't just in the Donbass, these Nazi battalions. In 2014, after the coup that the U.S. sponsored, some of those fascists went to the trade union, this house of trade unions in Odessa, and they burned it to the ground, and it killed over 40 people there. One of the folks who was helping us on this trip was also in that. He escaped. He was injured, but he escaped from there. So the damage that they're doing, they're not only just doing it in the Donbass region. You know, if you say anything against the narrative of the United States and the Ukrainian government, you get arrested, you possibly get tortured. So the infiltration of the fascists is not just there, and that's why the Russians are going after those areas to, like they said, denazify the area. And it really is it's a real infestation, and it's only going to get worse. And when you think about the fact that they could become a NATO member state and have nuclear weapons and all these other weapons, the javelins and all these things that are being sent. I mean, $22.4 billion since 2004, the U.S. has sent to Ukraine for regime change and things. They got so many weapons. In 2015, I think it was John Conyers and some other congressperson tried to get a bill to stop the money that was going to the fascists, because they knew these fascists were there already. So they had a bill saying that, okay, that you can give money to Ukraine, but it can't go to these fascists. And the Pentagon stepped in and squashed that. So yeah, this money is going right to them. And so it's a danger. It's a danger for the whole world. And so that's why they're doing what they're doing.
Most definitely. I want to play a clip. This is about some of the latest on the funding for Ukraine aid, and the House passing a bill to send money. I think it was like $80 billion. Recently, I think it was Rand Paul who voted against it. But I'm going to play this clip, and we'll talk about some of the ways in which the U.S. government uses, U.S. propaganda, imperialist media uses empathy and uses tricks to make people feel like, oh my God, we have to go in and save these poor Ukrainians from big bad Russia. So I'm going to play this clip and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
As Putin's war rages on, costing ordinary Ukrainians their lives and livelihoods, late Tuesday, the U.S. House overwhelmingly passing a $40 billion aid package. Ukraine says it urgently needs to win.
Time is of the essence.
This as the U.S. Director of National Intelligence warns of a potentially unpredictable and protracted war. Inside the old steel plant, the last Ukrainian stronghold in the devastated port city of Mariupol, fighting is raging on. Soldier Orest Kozatsky captured these haunting images of wounded Ukrainian soldiers. He sent NBC News a video message describing the dire conditions. He says inside a field hospital in the plant, a frequent target for airstrikes, all of the critical surgical equipment has been destroyed. He says the Russians are now in control of some parts of the factory. When the war broke out, the Medvedev family gathered together in Mariupol's city center because they thought it would be safer there. But there were no opportunities to leave, says Anzelika. As their building caught fire from the shelling, her husband Andriy and her son Dennis ran outside to see the damage. My husband returned shouting that our son was killed, she says. My husband approached Dennis's body, and in front of my eyes, he was also shot dead by a Russian sniper. I too wanted to run out, but my daughter-in-law yelled, "Please don't leave me alone," she says. Her husband and son's bodies were left on the street outside their home for 7 days. The two women were forced to escape through Russia, where they say they were interrogated at one of the notorious filtration centers. What did it feel like to arrive in Russia, given everything they did to your family? I could not even look at them because every one of them is guilty for what happened, even civilians for their silence. 2 months after the war began, Anzelika, Valeria, and little Carolina left Russia for Western Europe. It was the first moment they felt safe, says Anzelika. Safe at last, but so much lost.
So much propaganda there, man. And here's the thing, like, it's not that we're cheering on the death of Ukrainians. Like, we support all people who are victims of violence and war. We don't want war. We want peace. We want stability. But the way that they maneuver this to throw all of the blame at Russia, to paint the West as, I finally felt safe in the West. And when I was in Russia, I was all scared. And, you know, I find that interesting that she went to Russia first and not, you know, one of the Western European countries. So, you know, John, your analysis, like, why is there so much attention on Western Ukraine or people who are parroting this narrative? There's nothing. If you even look up the Odessa Union House massacre, there's almost nothing on this. No talk about the Donetsk and Lugansk people who were killed. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it's also hard to know what's true and what's not true, because we know from the Iraq War that the U.S. is willing to do anything, lie about anything, and you know, all the media was said, hey, yeah, they had weapons of mass destruction, and it's a fact, it's a fact. And then later on, the New York Times said an apology about how they didn't check their sources and da-da-da. But then they do it again and again. You know, there's a media outlet called the Kiev Independent, and that's in Kiev, and it was funded and by the European Endowment for Democracy, the National Endowment for Democracy, U.S. aid, and NATO money. So it's fully, and the journalists there, they all had their careers and things. All our projects were all sponsored by State Department money. And they come up with a lot of these stories that are being peddled, but folks don't know that they have a relationship with the Azov battalion, and the Azov feeds them information, and then they feed the information to CNN and Washington Post and all these other places, and they take it just like they took the stuff from the Iraq War. They take it as truth. They don't check it out or nothing, and then they present it all to us. So I don't know if every story is like that, and maybe some stories are true. I mean, it is war, and war is hell, but that means we have to try to figure out who promoted this war, who's fueling this war, and how to stop it. And what they're trying to do is get us to actually escalate it, and using these stories to escalate these things, to hide the fact that, like, not only the thing about the Odessa massacre, but the Azov battalion killed folks in Donetsk. They targeted civilians who were just lining up at an ATM machine, killing 20 of them. But you never heard about that either. And you're not hearing about these things because they're jailing the journalists and shutting down the TV stations and the media stations that don't play along with the U.S. narrative. So there's a lot, you know, when they first came out, there were pictures and videos of bombings. The Russians were bombing the Ukrainians, and you saw this. And then they found out that these were actually pictures of the Israelis bombing the Palestinians. Right. I remember in I think it was Syria or Iraq? There was photos of this kid jumping over all of these corpses, and they're saying this is happening in God, I can't remember. I think it was Syria. And then they found out, oh no, that was a photo taken somewhere else in the world. They do this all the time and manufacture these things all the time, and they've got a lot of money to do it. I mean, the propaganda, the budget, it used to not be so formalized, but now under Obama, it was formalized into a part of the budget of the military budget, propaganda. So they've got a lot of funds to be able to manufacture whatever they want to manufacture and get people's minds to forget about the fact that gas is now double what it used to be, that inflation is now highest in the last 40 years, since the last 40 years, which means poverty is just growing by leaps and bounds now, because you can't even buy food at a decent price. And all of this is partly because of this war. and they want to send 800 million more. And I mean, we're dying. 1,100,000 people died of COVID in this country, and they just sent $16 billion that was supposed to go to COVID relief, went to the Ukraine military so they could send them more weapons of mass destruction. And by the way, I was walking into one of these places places where the Ukrainian military had hold of, and they were using it to shoot at the Lugansk People's Republic soldiers. And you look in the wall, we walked in there, they have all these shells and stuff going on, and I look in the wall, and there's a big swastika right on the wall.
Oh, shit. What the fuck? Damn.
And so, I knew people would think, oh, maybe they just painted that just for your benefit. So,
yeah.
So I took my finger, I wet it, and I scrubbed up and down on this thing as hard as I could. And I looked at my finger, my finger was clean. This thing had been on there for a while.
Wow.
So that's the folks who were in there.
Yeah.
When we talk, you talk to the people about what's going on, and they definitely said, yeah, not everybody in the military was fascists or Nazis, but the ones who were leading them were. So
yeah, that's crazy. Wow.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, John. By the way, shout out to everybody who's in the chat. We got a good amount of comrades who are watching and listening to this. Really great questions on deck. One thing I wanted to ask you, John, before I take some of the other questions, as a Black militant anti-imperialist, as an anti-fascist, how did you feel in Ukraine being somewhere where you have a swastika and somewhere as common as a supermarket, you have a fascist battalion roaming the streets? Like, what was going through your mind? Like, how did that make you feel? Because I could imagine that must have been intense,
Yeah, the part that really gets to you is that, you kind of feel isolated in your own, and here, when the way the anti-war movement and folks who call themselves anti-imperialists were just poo-pooing the fascist problem in Ukraine away like it didn't really matter. Usually it was like white men who were doing that, by the way.
Yeah, it's true. Yep.
It's like, yeah, okay, I get you don't get it, but we're the ones who get attacked in this country by these white supremacist forces. And the fact is that they go there to the Ukraine and get training. I mean, there's like thousands and thousands of people around the world, fascist groups, that go to the Ukraine to get military training and then come back and use it against folks, especially people of color and stuff. So yeah, just seeing that and realizing how much money is going to these forces is really disheartening. But I asked there was a group of elderly women that were at one of these camps. It was a village that had been occupied by Ukraine, and the Russian and Lugansk forces pushed them out. So they were able to, some of them were able to return and all that kind of stuff. So we asked them a bunch of questions. And I said this thing, I said, well, what do you think about the people who think that they send money to the Ukraine and everything, and the Ukrainians are helping, stop these Russians from hurting you and things? What do you think about that? And there was a word they used. I can't remember what damn word it was in Russian, but they were all laughing and saying this word. Basically, they were saying stupid. that's just stupid.
Yeah, bullshit.
And I was glad I was able to get them to laugh too, because they're going through much. I mean, I was trying to talk to them about what it was like when the Ukrainian military was there, and a lot of them just didn't even want to talk about it. They just put their heads down and just shook their heads. It was like the horror of these forces. But yeah, that's one of the reasons we went there, is to really kind of expose this. When I first got there to Lugansk, I did an interview, and then they had me as part of this conference of religious leaders. And I had done some work with the SCLC on the grocery store closings and things. So they kind of wanted to get me in there. So they kind of used that to get me in this conference. And it was this huge hall, huge conference. And it was all religious leaders, Mufti from the Grand Mufti from Russia, and other religious leaders, Orthodox leaders and things. Were there, and the topic of discussion was combating Nazi propaganda in the Ukraine, because it's taking hold. So it's a huge problem, and we got to kind of shake the anti-war movement here to understand that you're promoting fascism when you're not
Yep.
when you're not talking about it, when you're saying it doesn't exist, when you're saying Russia, this is a Russian invasion. You're promoting fascism. It's
Exactly.
you're also leaving the people of Donbass out in the cold. I mean, what kind of allies are that? It's really.
I think of the expression, which side are you on? And a lot of these liberals, these latte liberals, they like to play both sides. They're like, neither Moscow nor Washington. We're,
Right.
and it's like, by doing that, you're putting fascists who are murdering innocent people and Russian-speaking people on the same level as Russia, and it's just crazy to me, the logic. We do have a great question from Comrade Big Teal. Shout out to you, Comrade Big Teal. How has the war in the region affected elections, both local and national, in Donbass? Are they able to still have political process and participate?
Well, now in Lugansk, probably Donetsk is probably very hard because they're still they haven't liberated that area yet, and most of Lugansk areas are liberated, so they're able to function. So they are able to have their processes. But after the coup in Ukraine itself, it's been taken over. I mean, first they had the coup, and then of course they didn't have any kind of legislative structures that were really able to have any kind of give people any kind of a democratic say so in the government. In fact, the people who are in the parliament, people should know, a lot of the socialists, the communist parties, socialist parties were now illegal. There's another bill that Zelensky is trying to. I guess that they were made informally illegal, but now he's trying to formalize it. But basically, there are no communist parties or socialist parties that are able to function in the Ukraine area. But it's just in the Donbass regions where they're able to flourish. And like I said, there's a bunch of hammers and sickles and red flags and all kinds of stuff. But there's other parties as well that function there. So that I'd say it's not back to where it used to be 100%, but it's back the legislative process. Anyway.
Most definitely, and it's just interesting because the Ukraine Euromaidan, these are the same people they call pro-democracy protesters, right? They use that in mainstream media all the time. Same thing with the Venezuelan opposition. The right-wingers are like pro-democracy, yet those are the people who murder communists and go out and murder union activists. And it's just really discussing how they flip and invert reality to fit their narrative. Another question from shout out to Comrade Josh, annoying question boy. Question for John. How can we take this information and the reality of what's happening and use it to organize resistance to this war and continuous wars by NATO, building real anti-imperialist militancy in the U.S.?
Yeah, we just have to take the information and get it out, and don't be afraid to. You're going to get hit back. You're going to get people going to call you, a Putin lover or child killer or whatever. But we have the truth. We got the facts. So, the more people that say it, the more it's going to make the narrative change of these. Even the mainstream media are going to have to change, like they did during Iraq. I mean, they were saying that sanctions are fine and the weapons of mass destruction, but then you keep hammering at the truth, and the truth it's there for everybody to see. So a lie can't stay contained for too long. The truth can't stay contained for too long. It busts out because it's in everybody's reality. So we just have to keep saying the reality, and it's going to resonate. And especially as time goes on, things like people finding out about this Victory Day that's not allowed in Ukraine are going to ask, well, why not? And all the other things that are going on and all the atrocities and the things that people can expose, which are going to get exposed even more. We're going to be on the side of truth, and people are going to know. The good thing is when you're talking truth, and folks are against you and things like that. But when the truth comes out, people are going to say, oh, now they know who the truth tellers are. And when the next crisis happens, they're going to know to go to those people first. So that's what's the advantage of telling the truth now. So just get it out there.
It's sort of like Syria. I remember, like, you were one of the people who early on were calling bullshit on mainstream media, were pointing out that a lot of the so-called chemical weapons attacks that were allegedly being carried out by Assad, they were false flag operations, they were BS. A lot of the sources, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, were controlled, like one guy in London being funded by all these institutions. And you were one of the people who pointed that out. And it seems like I remember that at that time period, like people like you, people like others who were critiquing the Western narrative on Syria, defending the Syrian people against imperialism, you guys were taking the heat, you know, me included, and not as much, but you and others, you know. But now it's like common sense, duh. Like, we know that the U.S. tried to invade and overthrow Syria, but that's in the past. And now it's like, it's commonly accepted. When you're in the heat of the moment, it seems like that's always the hardest time to stand by your principles, defend the truth. And so that's why I respect the work that you do and everything that you've said, because it's not easy. It's not easy to take a position that's unpopular, even though it is the truth. Shout out to Comrade Dust James. Any thoughts on the treatment of African students by the Ukrainian military and police?
Oh yeah, that's another indication of fascism, right? The fact that they wouldn't let, and the Poland's collaboration with these fascists in the Ukraine, how the African students, and not only students, I think there were doctors and other folks that were there that were just trying to get out like everybody else because of the war situation, and they wouldn't let them out. I mean, they wouldn't let them. They prioritized the Ukrainians. They were telling them, we're prioritizing Ukrainians first, and so they had all these African students and folks that couldn't get out, and their treatment in Ukraine is not not desirable as well. So it really shows. I mean, they push this ultra nationalism in Ukraine, and it's against the Russian people. They stopped folks from even being able to use their language in the stores and the schools. We talked to some folks in the shelters about how their children were suffering, their education was suffering because they were told that they couldn't speak Russian, and they couldn't, and the kids were having a hard time learning and things like that. So all of these kinds of things were happening against the Russian-speaking population because of this ultra nationalism that was being pushed. And of course, if they're going to be against the Russians, anybody that looks like has got a drop of African in their blood is going to be catching hell.
Of course.
And it's
especially
also,
if you're a leftist too.
Yeah. And it's also kind of funny how when they were trying to isolate Russia and get all these for everybody to get against the sanctions in Russia and all this stuff and to condemn them, a lot of the folks in the African countries, in the African continent, a lot of the countries in Africa said, no, we're not going to condemn Russia. They're the only ones that are actually helping us with the economic problems that the IMF and the World Bank and others are doing. And, so it's kind of interesting how they couldn't get the African countries in Africa to follow along.
No, it's true. And I think it shows the nature of imperialism and fascism. Like when you talk about the role of Russia versus US in the global South, people have such a totally different understanding. Like even if you go to, like I remember in 2019, I was in Haiti and there was huge protests going on against Jovenel Moise. And I remember in Haiti, like we're in the hoods of Haiti, like Haiti has been exploited for centuries by French imperialism, US imperialism. We're in the hoods of Haiti and I see somebody that had a Russian flag, that was waving a Russian flag, and it was like, Russia, please help us. And it was like down with, I think they call it like the Triple Alliance. It's like US, France, and Canada.
Oh yeah.
And if you go to a lot of parts of Latin America, you'll meet a lot of Latinos named Vladimir in solidarity with Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. Like that's actually a very common Latino name, Vladimir. You go to Africa, the independence movements against colonialism and and imperialism, so much support from the Soviet Union, from Russian and Soviet peoples. Same with Asia. And then it's once you start talking to right-wing fascist Ukrainians or right-wing people in Western Germany, that's when their relationship to Russia, they're like, Russia's this evil empire, this tyrant. It's like, what about the shit that you guys have been doing all over around the world? You know, I'm pretty sure Russia wasn't like Belgium that colonized the Congo and murdered like 3 million Africans. You know, so you know, what are your thoughts on that? On people trying to equate Russia with like Western imperialism?
Yeah, and they like you said, they forget the history. About a third of the countries in Africa were liberated by Russia, and with also China would help, but in the 60s, that wouldn't have happened if Russia didn't exist. And who knows what would have happened if the Nazis were able to win the World War II? What would have happened to the Black population and the African population there? Because if it wasn't for the Soviet Union, they would have won. But people will say now, well, that's not the Soviet Union. Now they had a counter-revolution, and so we shouldn't support them. But if you look at Ukraine, they don't allow communist organizations to exist. They used to be in the parliament. They used to be in Russia. There's the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. They exist. They're the second largest party in the parliament. And there's other communist parties that we met with that exist, United Communists, and other folks so they're able to exist there. And the fact is that, you know, the people didn't change. They might have had a counter-revolution, but the people there are still the people whose parents and grandparents died in the Patriotic War in World War II. So they're going to feel a little bit, they're not going to be so happy about fascism on their borders and things like that. So, but also what they forget about, not only the continent of Africa, but also Latin America, is the folks who are targeted by U.S. imperialism: Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, all over the world. All those targets of U.S. imperialism are helped by the help of Russia economically to get over the sanctions that the U.S. does, but also militarily. The U.S. would surely go into a lot of these countries more aggressively militarily if it wasn't for Russia standing in the way. So if Russia loses this war, if NATO wins this war, it's not only going to hurt Russia, it's going to hurt all the targets of U.S. imperialism. People don't seem to understand that, which side that Russia, even though it's not socialist anymore because they had a counter-revolution, but it's not an imperialist country. They don't. They export raw materials. They're productive, technical. The amount of technical. What am I trying to say? The technology. The technology that's incorporated in their production processes are still less than what it is in the United States and Western Europe. So when they do trade with each other, they lose out on the trade, just like any non-imperialist country. So economically, they're not an imperialist country. They got about the same GDP as South Korea and I think South Korea and India. So it's not the same thing. You've got an imperialist country against a non-imperialist country, which is protecting the other targets of U.S. imperialism. So that's the way they have to look at it, but they're not seeing it that way.
And that's why political education and the work that you do is so important, because we have to go back to the basics. Lenin, right? The Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, 1917 pamphlet, where he explains that imperialism is not any sort of just military operation you have overseas or in a different country. Imperialism is an economic system, a base of characterized by monopoly capitalism, parasitic capitalism in its highest and last stage, where you have very few multinational banking institutions, finance institutions running the world and dividing the world. I'm pretty sure it's not Russia that has Latin America and the Caribbean into trillions of dollars in debt. It's not Russia that has Africa and Asia and trillions of dollars in debt. That is the World Bank. That is the International Monetary Fund. That is Western imperialism. And I think this is why it's so important for people for us as communists, as leftists, to really put out political education, because now you have these liberals using words like imperialism, using words like reactionary and fascism, but then they're subverting it for the purpose of empire. They're using it for pray for Ukraine rallies, and we have to oppose Russian imperialism and Russian fascism.
Yeah.
And it's just really sickening to see that. So, just kind of wrapping up here in the last 10 minutes or so that we have, John, why don't you share with us what was the most powerful moment of your trip to Donbass, and tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, there were a lot of powerful moments there.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that kind of hit me was, I don't know, just as we're walking through through some of these areas that were hit by the Ukrainian military, civilian apartments, houses, all those kinds of things. And when they fire these things, not all of them exploded, so they'd be in the ground, and there's mines in the ground. And so it just hit me once when the Lugansk People's Republic soldiers and the Russian soldiers that were taking us so we could see what we needed to see. And I noticed, they're walking in front of me, and they're telling me, okay, you got to follow my steps, to stay close to my steps, because, you don't want to blow up. So of course I did that. But it just hit me, these people are risking their lives to get the truth out, so that the people in the United States can understand what's going on. So they stop sending these weapons to these people. And it just, the arrogance of the U.S., sitting at home and saying, "Oh, those Russians are doing," and just the arrogance, it just hit me. These people are risking their lives to try to stop fascism and to show what's going on, and they're not even being respected. They're not even being heard. It's like they think the Cold War propaganda is alive and well in their heads. Even the folks who were supposedly communist before, it's alive and well, and they think all that stuff is true, that the Russia bad, the West good.
Right.
So everything Russia says, so if TASS says something, or Russians say, soldiers say anything, it's okay. Yeah, they're going to be biased. Yeah, so is the U.S. going to be biased. But why aren't you listening to what they're saying? Just to get to get more at the truth. So just that the willingness of these people to fight for the truth is, and under these conditions, that's kind of, it's kind of a thing. Going to the shelters and seeing this woman was crying about, she had nothing. She didn't have a home anymore. They blew up her home. All her possessions were on this little cot that she had. And she didn't have any family, and she didn't know. And so the caretaker, who's got tons of work to do and lots of things that she's doing, and stress, and she's got her own child and stuff, and she goes to her, "Don't worry, we're your family now. We're your family." So the compassion, it just shows how war creates. It really brings up to the surface the devils, but it also brings up to the surface the angels, and we got to be on the side of the angels.
Exactly. Wow, that's powerful. And I'm sure at some point during your trip, you must have felt like breaking down, or just anger, sadness, or all of them, because you're seeing this brutal reality. But then in mainstream media, it's a complete opposite. I know for me, that always pisses me off when I see that. Like when I was in Nicaragua last year twice, and I visited the areas where the right-wing opposition backed by the U.S. were burning down markets, where Sandinista markets, where they sell stuff, they sell food and families and working class families. I went there with my girlfriend, with Ophelia, talked to some of the shopkeepers, and they were like, yeah, the fascists, they encircled this whole shopping area, they burned down our shops. If you had a red and black on you, like you were murdered, tortured in the street. And then you see mainstream media, and they're saying that the Sandinistas are doing all this, that the Nicaraguan government is doing all this. And it's like your blood starts boiling, because you're seeing right in front of you with your very eyes something that is horrible and horrific, working class people under attack, and yet they are portrayed as the evil bad guys. Just wrapping up here, John, I wanted to ask you, talk a little bit about, because you're also somebody who You're a man of action. You're campaigning. You have a senatorial candidacy. You know, tell us a little bit about Socialist Unity Party, Peace and Freedom, and what you stand for, and why your work is important, especially here in California, where we have so much homelessness, so much poverty, and all this money that is going to Ukraine could be used right here in LA. So tell us a little bit about that, your platform, and what you stand for.
Yeah, it's basically saying that we need to take control over things that are so important to our lives. Global warming is getting to the point where it's going to be irreversible if we don't seriously do something about it. And we know these corporations don't want to. And the Pentagon is the greatest single entity of contributing to global warming. But they want to create more wars. So we need to take control of the military-industrial complex. We need to take control of the electric companies and the oil companies and all of the hard industry that affects our lives on a daily basis. We can't vote for what we need. They just make the decisions based on the monopolies that own these things and the banks, what they finance. Inflation is very high right now because of a supply shortage, which was created partly by what they don't want to invest in manufacturing. They want to invest in cryptocurrency and stock games on Wall Street, which doesn't create anything except inflation. But we don't have any decision in making that. So that's why we're talking about pushing socialism, because socialism means the people who create the wealth take the means of production and they make the decisions. It's a much more democratic way of running society. So that's what this thing is about, is trying to build a movement to understand that these politicians, both Democrats and Republican, they have the same sponsors, the multinational, the financial, industrial multinationals and monopolies. They run these folks and they run these two parties. But we're not going to get anything if we depend on them. I mean, right now they're trying to sell us World War III. So we have to start an independent movement. And we have the power to do that. We are the ones that create the wealth. In 2006, when the immigrant community came out and had a boycott, one day corporations lost billions of dollars, and they got their point across. There was a horrible bill that was going to go through, and they got rid of that bill in a second because they used their labor power. We got the power. We just have to organize. So that's what this campaign is about, trying to build that unity and empowerment and power. That's why we're running, basically, to do that and to get that word out. And last time we reached, the last two times I ran, we must have reached about 60,000 people. So
wow.
It's a good way to get the word out about what's going on. And right now, the issues of abortion and the issues of war are going to be front and center. So, why do we have that Supreme Court anyway?
Right, exactly.
Be there. So I know there's demonstrations right now. Some of our members are at fighting for abortion, so abortion rights. So yeah, that's why we're running.
That's awesome. And people still have the audacity to claim socialism has failed. It's never worked. People don't care about it. Like, from South Central LA to Donbass, you have socialist sentiment on the rise. Like, people are seeing in the hoods of LA and New York and the US that capitalism does not work. You have so many empty houses here in LA and tons of unhoused people who could easily be accommodated and moved into those houses. You have an irrationality of capitalism, as Marx talks about, irrationality of capitalism, the anarchy of production, more houses than unhoused people. And then in Donbass, you have, like you said, I think that's a great point that you hit on earlier, that even though people talk about the so-called collapse of the Soviet Union, I like to say the coup, or the overthrow, the counter-revolution, the betrayal of the Soviet Union, you have that. And so the narrative that people in the West have is oh, okay, they tried that, it failed, good guys won, capitalism won, the end. It's no, wait a second, there's still millions and millions of people in the former Soviet Union that believe in communism, that fight for communism. They saw how horrible capitalism and neoliberalism was under, Yeltsin and all of these people who actually are enemies, class enemies. And now you have a huge resurrection of socialist communist sentiment in these countries, people waving hammer and sickle flags, nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and in the US, a rise in interest for socialism and communism as well. So I think you do a great job at linking the two and showing the importance of internationalism as well, because we can't just promote workers' rights and socialism in the US without being like, wait a second, we have comrades in Donbass whose grandparents were communist fighters against the Nazis, who this day are fighting for socialism and anti-imperialism, anti-fascism in Donbass as well. We have to link up and learn from our struggles. International proletarianism, that's very key and very important. So, John, any last comments you want to make before we head out?
No, that's we hit everything. I'm so glad you had me here, and just for folks though, don't get demoralized. Keep fighting, and join an organization and fight. That's we gotta stay strong, because our children and the other people's children, our next generation, is going to depend on the work that we do right now, especially to stop this war.
Most definitely. Thank you so much, John. I want to link up with you at some point. You're right here in LA, so I'll hit you up. Afterward we can link up. My schedule is crazy busy, so unfortunately I don't have that much free time. But I'd love to hang out with you sometime soon. We got the summit. I think it's the Summit of the Americas, the protests, the counter protests coming up. So maybe we could link up then. But John, it's always been a pleasure. I have a lot of respect for the work that you do, because you take the unpopular positions, but you're principled, right? You don't care if some liberal hipsters are calling you out and calling you a Putin lover and all this stuff. You stand firm. You stand by the truth. So as Big Teal said, organize. Please support John's website, johnparkerforussenate.org. John Parker, a Peace and Freedom Party and Socialist Unity Party senatorial candidate based in South Central LA. Shout out to South Central. John recently traveled to Russia and Lugansk People's Republic. Please support John's website. Check him out. Please support his campaign, doing really amazing stuff. Thank you so much, John. It's been a pleasure. I'd love to have you back on soon. We're going to go out to some music from one of my favorites, Tupac, linking the struggles of war and poverty. They got money for wars, but they can't feed the poor. And we had two important holidays that recently passed, Mother's Day and Victory Day. So shout out to the mothers of Donbass who are feeding their children, maintaining the family, but also resisting fascism on the front lines against imperialism. So shout out to them, homage to them. Peace out, John. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.
The sweeter the juice, I say the darker the flesh. The deeper the roots, I give a holler to my sisters on welfare. Do I care if nobody else can. And I know they like to beat you down a lot. And when you come around the block, brothers clown a lot. But please don't cry, dry your eyes, never let up. Forgive, but don't forget, girl, keep your head up. And when he tells you ain't nothing, don't believe him. If you can't learn to love, then you should leave him. Hey, baby, you don't need him. And I ain't trying to gas out by just calling how I feel. You know what makes me happy? When brothers make babies and leave a young mother to be a pappy. Now since we all came from a woman, got our name from a woman, and I came from a woman. I'm reason why we take from our women, why we rape our women, do we hate our women? I think it's time we kill for our women, time to heal our women, be real to our women. And if we don't have a race of babies, I will hate the ladies that make the babies. And since a man can't make one, he has no right to season rain, I never let up. I try to keep my head up, still keep them getting wetter. You know it's funny when it rains and pours. Got money for war, but can't feed the poor. They say it ain't no hope for the youth, and the truth is it ain't no hope for the future. And then they wonder why I'm crazy. Bring my mother, but learning my brother. It's all crack, baby. We ain't meant to survive. It's a setup, even when you're better.